Over the course of the year, there are a few days on the Buddhist calendar or in the Zen calendar that kind of stand out. And often they go right by me. They rarely fall on a Tuesday, but this year we find ourselves here on a Tuesday evening on October 5th, which is Bodhidharma Day. This is the day when traditional monasteries and temples do a special service for Bodhidharma. It's not a big thing. It's not the whole day, but it's in the calendar and it absolutely happens. This one moment of pausing and recognizing this character in the Zen tradition. And so I want to talk a little bit about him today. And I've talked about him a lot in the past. Everybody knows I'm kind of fond of him. For those who maybe haven't heard of him, Bodhidharma is this character who supposedly came from India around the 5th century and brought the kind of nascent Zen tradition from there to China and planted it there. And what I always say is, that if there had been no Bodhidharma, they would have had to invent him. And then also that's probably what they did. He's perfect. He's absolutely perfect for our purposes for so many reasons. One, because he links this tradition that was growing and evolving in China to India and to the lineage there. So he serves this really critical authentication role, right? If something just develops in China, well, that feels homemade. It feels maybe like it's not real. But if you can say that someone brought it from India, right, and that person can trace his own lineage back, that's great. Now everything's above board. So he serves that really perfect function. He serves another perfect function, which is that he comes to another country and transcends language and transcends culture and still somehow perfectly transmits the Dharma, right? That is important not only in China, but it becomes important in Japan, it becomes important in Vietnam, it becomes important in Korea. Each time this transmission happens, there's this perfect example of how it can happen, how it can go beyond what Bodhidharma called words and letters and go to the heart of the matter. So it's a perfect justification. It says it's okay for this to move from one place to another. It's okay for this to move from one language to another because we know that there's a way of getting it across. It isn't dependent on us having that kind of cultural or linguistic fluency. That's really critical in not just in Zen in those moments, but in Zen's story about what it is and what makes it authentic. And then there's, of course, the personality, which is this completely uncompromising, completely kind of uncouth, unkempt, unrefined man. In this world, this Dharma world where people are wearing brocade robes and they're all, super educated and they come from various kinds of wealth and they have this Confucian knowledge. Here comes this guy who admittedly, supposedly is a prince originally because everybody is originally a prince, but who has no regard at all for station. He has no interest in appearance. And so he looks terrible. He probably smells terrible. He has no interest in being the classy guy in the room. He's just there to practice and nothing else. This too deeply informs Zen's idea of what it is, even though, in truth, most of the Zen tradition across cultures becomes kind of like a pinnacle of cultural refinement, becomes very concerned with decorum, very concerned with appearance, very concerned with form. There's that reality, but also a kind of story that's the opposite of that. So we have this character, and I like this day partly because we just get to kind of let him soak in, whether he was real or not. But I wanted today, because I have talked about him so much, to talk a little bit about his teachings. There are certain teachings that are attributed to him. And again, I say this with a grain of salt, because what if he never existed? Well, then these teachings, though they have their own value, they were reverse attributed to him to give them more weight, of course, right? We can just kind of live with this. But whatever happened there, the fact is that there are certain things that he is said to have taught that then had a deep influence on the tradition, in the same way that he had a deep influence on the tradition, even if he maybe never showed up. And so what I thought I'd bring to the table today is there's this teaching of the 2 entrances and the 4 practices. And I won't go into it in any depth for a few reasons. But I wanted to introduce it because it's interesting. The 2 entrances. Bodhidharma says that he starts out by saying many methods lead to the path. However, fundamentally, there are only 2. He says principle and practice. Or some translations might say reason and practice. And he goes on to explain, first, the idea of principle or reason. That one way of entering the practice is to receive teachings first. And he specifically mentions the 3 seals, for example, that if you come across teachings about impermanence, about dissatisfaction, about interdependence, and if these strike you as true, then that's one way that you find your way to practice. It's one way that you find yourself on the path. This is very obvious. And for a lot of people, this is how it goes. So many people read a book first, or they see a video on YouTube first, or they attend a teaching first, they listen to a podcast first. And through that, they think, well, this has value. This is compelling. I should explore more. And theoretically, that then leads them to practice. And then Bodhidharma says, the other way that people come to the path is directly through practice. Which is to say, their friend says, why don't you come and try Zazen on a Tuesday night? And say, well, what's it about? And you say, oh, just try it. And you come and you sit. You sit in this posture and you breathe in this way, or you bow in this way, or you chant in this way. And through that direct contact, either through intuition or through then direct listening, you encounter those teachings that for other people might have been the way in. And you verify them. You verify through practice, oh, impermanence is real. Dissatisfaction is real. Interdependence is real. These teachings are true. And I know because I'm doing this experiment over here. So the very simple formulation, right? The teachings lead us to practice, or the practice leads us to the teachings. It's kind of obvious. But you hear this echoed later. Dogen talks about this. He doesn't go into it in as much detail as Bodhidharma did, but he talks about, just very kind of offhand, about how people enter through principle and through practice. This gets under the skin of the tradition. But when he talks about practice then, and this is the part that I think is interesting, he gets into four of them. There are four practices. So sometimes this is called the teaching of the two entrances and four practices. And the four practices look like this. He says there are four all-inclusive practices. One is essentially recognizing karma. And he explains for a bit that in this practice, in this particular practice, you look at, and this is very classic Buddhism, he says, you know, whatever you experience, whatever injustice you experience, whatever suffering you experience, whatever discomfort you experience, you look at that and you say, well, causes and conditions led to this. I understand that karma is playing itself out right now in whatever I feel. We could talk about that for a long time. The second is adapting to conditions or conforming to conditions. And I'll see if I can find a good line about that. Essentially, that whatever comes our way, this is similar to the first, whatever conditions we find ourselves in, we meet them with acceptance. So if it's hot, it's hot. If it's cold, it's cold. That kind of thing. Dogen also talks a lot about that. Seeking nothing, what's also translated as not craving, is the third practice. Right? This is, I don't know, there's something about this that always strikes me funny, because the Four Noble Truths are all about getting under craving or getting under attachment and saying kind of how to work with that. And it feels jarring when someone says, well, just don't do it. Just don't crave anything. Don't be attached to anything. But that's the third all-inclusive practice. And then the fourth is practicing in accordance with the Dharma. And this is very similar in a way to number two. It's practicing in accordance with reality as it presents itself. It's a very, and I'd say classically Buddhist in a way that I think should, for all of us, might feel a little bit challenging. For someone who is connected with this kind of spontaneous and wordless version of the practice, in fact, the teachings attributed to him in some cases are not really resonant with a lot of how the Zen tradition talks today. So this feeling of almost resignation, this feeling of, well, you know, it's almost like it's kind of my fault that things are as they are, and I shouldn't try to change them. I should just kind of work with them, is the kind of thing that if you spin it one way can feel very alive, and if you spin it another way can feel very dead. Just to acknowledge that. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on these four practices, because in some ways to go into these four is to go into a lot of kind of foundational Buddhist views, and that can take us a long, long time. But what I wanted to bring up that I think is so interesting and so, for me, thought it was so compelling, and maybe it will be for you, but maybe it will just feel like trivia, is I was reading up on these and discovering that, you know, one of the things that is attributed to Bodhidharma is he talked about the practice of wall gazing or wall contemplation. And of course, the story is that Bodhidharma sat in a cave for 9 years, just meditating and facing a wall. And so this language comes up in the teachings that are attributed to him, that the center of the path, the central practice, is wall gazing. And what I was reading today was a reminder that nobody knows what that means. We've reverse engineered it to assume that it means literally facing a wall. And so for 1,500 years, people in this tradition have sat facing the wall. literally. But one of the things that I was reading today was pointing out that there's one interpretation that's been around for a long time, that these four practices, where he talks about principle and practice, that the four practices themselves are referred to as walls. They create a room. They create a space where no matter where you look, you're seeing the truth, you're seeing the reality of practice. And within that framework, the idea might be that he wasn't saying to literally sit down and face the wall, but to not look away from, to not flinch at looking at these four things, essentially to surround yourself with these four truths, these four practices, and look at nothing but them all the time. It just becomes a joke on ourselves. That first, we probably create the guy, and then we attribute teachings to the guy we created. And then we don't do a very good job of writing those teachings down. And then they become a guidebook for how to do the practice when we aren't really sure how to do it. It's great. This is what religion looks like. And it's kind of fun. So I'm not saying don't look at the wall. The wall is very handy. But I think there's a good argument to be made through the way that Bodhidharma talks about entering through principle, and then this theory of the four walls, that what Bodhidharma is really saying is that the heart of practice is to look at things as they are, which is also perfectly resonant with what this tradition has upheld. That it is a practice of not looking away. It is a practice of non-distraction. It is a practice of keeping your eyes open all the time, which he embodies by cutting his own eyelids off so that he can't blink. The simple version of that story is that he did it so that he wouldn't sleep. But what we can also see when we look at that image of him with those bulging eyes, and he's looking right at all of us, with the eyes that follow us around the room, is that this is a person who isn't looking away. It's not simply that he's trying to not drift. It's that he's made a choice to structure his life so that it's impossible for him to close his eyes to reality. All of this is my long way of saying, no matter how we talk about this guy, no matter how we tell the story about this guy, he comes out really cool. He comes out as this incredible model of practice, and maybe he comes out as a model of this part of the practice, and maybe he comes out as a model of this part of the practice. But he's unavoidable. If we come to this practice, we come to this tradition, if we spend any time in it, he's like this huge rock that we have to go around or we have to go over. He's so solid in front of us. He's such a challenge to our own idea of the path. At any moment when we think maybe there's a way that's not quite like this, maybe there's an easier way, maybe there's an alternative way, he's there to say, no, there's this way. And you can do it. Because I did it. I'm really glad that we have this character. He's better than Santa Claus. That's where I'll stop.